Hello, I'm Edward Tarte, chess enthusiast. In this video, I am going to explain how to play the game that I love, chess. Chess is played by two players called white and black, white having light-colored pieces, black having dark-colored pieces. They face each other across a chessboard which is 8 squares by 8 squares. They take turns moving. White always moves first. The chessboard is placed so that there is a white square in the lower right-hand corner for each player. That would be for white at H1 and for black at A8. Here are the pieces. Each player has a queen. The white queen is placed on white square, D1. Black queen is placed on a dark-colored square, D8. The queen's crown has points. Next to the queen is the king on E1 for white, E8 for black. Then the queen and king are flanked by two bishops, two knights, they look like horses, and in the corners two rooks, sometimes called castles. And then you have these 8 pawns. That's the opening position. Now I will explain how each piece moves. Each piece has its own way of moving. First, I will explain how a rook moves. A rook can move by sliding any number of squares horizontally or vertically, as long as there is no piece in the way. So, for example, in this situation, white's rook can move to any of the squares where you see circles, but cannot move to E2 because his own bishop is there, nor can he jump over the bishop and move to E1. But because captures in chess occur by a piece occupying the enemy piece and thus removing it from the board, this rook could, if white chose, capture this knight of black that's on E8. So that's the rook. Next, how does a bishop move? A bishop moves diagonally by sliding any number of diagonal squares as long as there's no piece in the way. So this black bishop can move by sliding to any of these squares where you see a circle. This other black bishop can move to any of the squares where you see a circle. It cannot move to D3 because one of its own pawns is there, nor to E2, nor to F1. But if it's black's turn, black can, if it chooses, capture this white rook. So that's how bishops move. You'll notice in the opening position, each player has one bishop on a light-colored square and the other bishop on a dark-colored square. Together, they can traverse the entire chessboard. But because each bishop is restricted to squares of only one color, a bishop is considered not as valuable a piece as a rook, which can traverse, theoretically, the entire chessboard. In point value, a rook is considered to be worth 5 points, a bishop 3 points. Next, the queen. A queen can do everything a rook can do, plus everything a bishop can do. A queen, that is, can move horizontally by sliding or by sliding diagonally any number of squares as long as there's no piece in the way. So this queen can move to any of the squares that I've shown with circles. This white queen can move to any of the squares that I've shown with a circle, but it cannot move to D4 because its own knight is there, nor to D3, nor D2, nor D1. However, if it's white's move, this queen can, if it chooses, capture the black pawn on g3. Since the queen can do everything that a rook can do and everything that a bishop can do in moves, the queen is more valuable a piece than either a bishop or a rook. The queen's point value is considered to be 9 points, compared with rook's 5 points and bishop's 3 points. Next, the knight. The knight is unique. It has a type of move all its own, and it doesn't slide, it jumps. The other pieces slide. The knight's move is to move from one corner to the opposite corner of a 3x2 rectangle. For example, this knight can move to this square, 3x2, to this square, 2x3 or 3x2, to this square, 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 or to this square. Each one is the opposite corner of a 3x2 rectangle. No other piece can do anything like that, and the knight can do that even if there are pieces close to it. For example, this bishop is no hindrance to the knight moving to here or to here. The knight just jumps over it. Or there could be an enemy piece close by. This rook of black is no hindrance to the knight moving to here or to here. The knight just jumps to its new square. If there's a queen here, and it's white's move, white can, if it chooses, capture the black queen with its knight. So that's how the knight moves. A knight is considered to be worth about 3 points, comparable to the point value of a bishop. Next, how does a pawn move? White pawns begin on the 2nd rank, black pawns begin on the 7th rank. Pawns move only forward, that is, away from the player, and only one square at a time, except each pawn, if there's nothing in its way, can move 2 squares on its very first move. So if it's white's move, white can, if it chooses, move the e-pawn either 1 square forward or 2 squares forward. If it's black's move, and black wants to move his b-pawn, he can move it either 1 square away from him, which we'll call forward, or 2 squares forward as the first move of that pawn. After its first move, the pawn can move only 1 square forward at a time. But a pawn doesn't capture in the same way that it moves. A pawn captures 1 square forward diagonally. So, for example, if it's white's move and these black pieces are in front of it, white cannot move to e4 because the black bishop's in the way, but it can capture either the black rook on f4, notice that's a diagonal move, or diagonal in the other direction. It can capture the black knight on d4. So a pawn moves Vertically, when it isn't a capture, it moves diagonally to capture. There are two other things that I need to say about pawn moves. One of them is called capturing en passant. If this is the position and it's black's move, this would be black's first move of his pawn on f7. From what I've said earlier, he has the option of moving to either f6 or f5. If he moves to f6, rather than choosing to move to f5, white has the option on his very next move of actually capturing the pawn as if the pawn had moved to f6. And this is called capturing en passant. It can only be on that very next move of white. After that, he does not have the option. I just illustrated that with white doing the capturing. Now I will illustrate it with black doing the capturing. Suppose it is white's move. He has not yet moved his c2 pawn, so he could move it either one space forward to c3 or two spaces forward to c4. If he moves it one space forward to c3, black can, if he chooses, capture it. That would be a normal pawn capture. On the other hand, if white chooses to move his c-pawn two spaces forward, black can pretend on his very next move, if he wishes, that that pawn was moved only to c3 and can capture it en passant. One other very important thing about pawns. If a pawn gets to the other side of the board, that is, to the far rank, it must become either a queen, a rook, a bishop, or a knight. It does not remain a pawn. It is promoted to one of those more valuable pieces. So, for example, white moves his pawn to d4, black moves his rook to c7, white moves, black moves, white moves, black moves here. This is a very poor move, but here's what could happen. White can capture the rook, or he could move to d7. Let's suppose he captures the rook. And then after black moves, white moves his pawn to e8. He must exchange it for a queen, a rook, a bishop, or knight. Since the queen is the most valuable, that's the most likely exchange. So now the pawn is a queen. And that could be true even if white already had his original queen on the board. White could have more than one queen now. And finally, concerning the moves of the pieces, how does the king move? The king can move to any adjacent square, either horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. And so this king, as shown here, can move to any of the squares that have circles. In this diagram, the king can move to any of the squares where I have circles. He can't move to e4 because his own pawn is there. He can, if he chooses, capture the black knight. Now I need to explain the purpose of the game and how a player wins. The purpose of the game is to put your enemy's king in a position that is under attack by you so severely that there's no way for the king to get out of attack. If that happens, it's called checkmate. The king is never actually captured. The game ends. I'll give you some examples. Suppose it's white's move, and white moves his queen to d8. He is attacking black's king. When that happens, white should say check. That is, he is putting black's king in check. Black has the immediate responsibility of getting out of check, that is, out of attack, so that his king will no longer be attacked. Well, black can do it in exactly one way, by capturing white's queen with his knight. So that's one way for black to get out of check. It was the only way in this situation. Here's another situation. It's white's move. White moves his queen to d8 and says check because he's attacking black's king. This time black has a way of getting out of check by interposing his bishop, that is, blocking the queen's line of attack by moving his bishop to f8. And now the game can continue because black is no longer in check. Here's a situation a little bit different from the others in that black's h-pawn is on h6 instead of h7. Suppose it is white's turn. White again moves his queen to d8 and says check. Now black can get out of check by moving his king to h7, and the game can continue. Here's one more situation. Again, white's move, and again, white moves his queen to d8 and says check. Now, black can't get out of check. There's no piece to capture the attacking queen. There's no piece to block the line of attack. And the only squares to which black can move his king are h8 and f8. And so this is checkmate. The game ends. And white has won. Here's one more example of a checkmate, this time by black. Suppose it is black's move, and black moves his queen to d1. He is attacking white's king, so black says check. White does not have any legal move. He can't move to e1 or g1 because he would still be in check from black's queen, and he can't move to e2. He would be in check from both black's queen and black's rook, nor can he move to f2 nor g2 because he'd be in check from black's rook. And so white has no legal moves. So this is checkmate. The game is over. Black has won. Now I need to explain a special move in chess, the only move in chess that involves moving two pieces at once. It's called castling, and it's a way to get your king near a corner of the board where the king is more likely to be relatively safe. Here's how it's done. Castling can be done either on king's side or on queen's side, and involves your king and one of your rooks. Neither piece must have previously moved. They must both be on their original squares, not having moved earlier in the game. Whether castling king's side or queen's side, here's how it's done. You move the king 2 spaces toward the rook, and then move the rook just to the other side of the king. So the new position will look like this. Here's castling on the queen's side. Again, the king will move 2 spaces toward the rook, and the rook will move just to the other side of the king. So the new position will look like this. All the squares between the two pieces have to be unoccupied, and the king must not be in check, nor must any square that the king passes over be attacked by an enemy piece. For example, in this situation, if it's white's move, he cannot castle because he's in check from the black queen. In this situation, if it's white's move, he cannot castle because his king would be passing over a square d1 that is under attack from black's bishop. In this position, white cannot castle because he would move his king to c1 and be putting himself in check, and that's not allowed. In this position, white can castle because the rook of black is attacking b1, but b1 is not one of the squares that the king passes over or moves to. So here, castling would be permitted by white if he chooses. So the standard way of winning in chess is by checkmating your opponent's king. However, there is another very common way of winning, and that's just to have your opponent resign, that is, give up, and you have won if your opponent resigns. Now, it's also possible for a game of chess to end up in a draw, a tie, where neither player wins. And I will first describe the kind of draw that's called stalemate. Stalemate occurs when your king is not in check, but you have no legal move. That's stalemate, which is a kind of draw. I'll give an example of that. Suppose it is black's move, and black plays king to g3. White has no legal move. He cannot capture the pawn because he'd be in check from the black king, nor can he move to g1 because he'd be in check from the pawn, nor to g2 because he'd be in check from the king. So white is not in check, but he has no legal move. That's stalemate. That's different from when you are in check and have no legal move. That's checkmate and your opponent has won. Another way for a game to end in a draw is if the same position occurs 3 times in a row. Here's an example of that. Suppose it is black's turn. He moves his rook to a5, check. White gets out of check by interposing his rook. Then black moves back to a6. White moves back to f6. Black moves back to a5. White interposes, getting out of check by moving his rook to f5. Black moves his rook back to a6. White moves his rook back to f6. This is threefold repetition, and this game is now a draw. It's over. Neither white nor black has won. It is sometimes possible for a player who is at a disadvantage materially to force a threefold repetition by checks in what is known as perpetual check. For example, suppose here it is black's move, and black plays queen to a3, check. White's only legal move is king to b1. Then black plays queen to b3, check. White's only legal move is to move his king back to a1, and black moves queen to a3, check, and we're going back and forth. This is perpetual check, threefold repetition forced by black, and in spite of being behind materially, black has achieved a draw. Here's another example of a game ending in a draw. Suppose it's black's turn and black captures white's rook. white recaptures with his king. Now the only two pieces on the board are the pair of kings. The kings cannot get next to each other because that would violate the rule of chess. A person cannot put his own king in check. So all the kings would be able to do is wander around the board, staying away from each other. And they don't even do that. As soon as there are just two kings on the board, the game is over. It's a draw. And a chess game can end in a draw by mutual agreement. That is, one player can offer his opponent a draw and his opponent accepts. Then the game ends and neither person has won. And there's one other rarely occurring way that a game can end in a draw, and that's if 50 moves are made by each player consecutively with no pawn having moved and no captures having taken place. Here is a situation that might end in a draw. White has, besides his king, a bishop and a knight. Black has only his king. It is possible, if white is very skilled, to force black's king into a checkmate position by having his knight and bishop work together in a very careful way. But it's very difficult, and generally only a very skilled player can do it. It's quite possible that in this situation, 50 moves of each player could occur. There are no pawns on the board, and without a capture. And if that would occur, this game would end in a draw. And that concludes my video on how to play chess. If and when you play chess, I wish you the maximum mental stimulation and pleasure. Thank you for watching.